Welcome to ADF Property, the podcast where we talk about all things property investing and real estate for Australian Defence Force personnel. Whether you're looking to build and scale a property portfolio or relocating across Australia, we've got the insights and tips for less stress and more success. Let's dive in.
Well, g'day everyone. It's Liam Garman and Kane Dury from the ADF Property Podcast. Kane, mate, welcome back to the studio.
It's been another month.
It's been another month.
So here we are. So last episode we had 5 steps to supercharge your rent investing strategy. It was a bit of a hit, very popular.
It was. And I did a throw out. I did a throw out at the end of that podcast. If you have any questions, reach out. And I did get a question.
Yeah, nice.
And I thought, well, it's actually not one question that I received. It was a bundle of questions, but all with the same theme.
Yeah, right.
And that theme is... because we were talking about, for the last few episodes, DOHAS, which is an incredibly important tool if you're in defence or if you're a veteran and you might have accumulated some kind of accounts receivable. How else do you put it? With DOHAS. And some people reaching out said, hey, Liam, question for Kane. I've actually spoken to a buyer's agent, or I've spoken to a mortgage broker, I've spoken to someone in the industry, and they said, don't bother, it's too much effort, you're only getting a couple $100 back a month, you're going to have a much higher interest rate, it's just not worth your time, come with me and I'll find you a better place without DOHAS. That didn't seem to sit well with me, that didn't seem to make a lot of sense. Kane, mate, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I feel these people saying that don't bother, just uninformed, and I guess DOHAS, there's the 3 lenders, right? There's NAB, must be direct to bank. So brokers can't write that.
Which is why they're trying to herd you away from it.
That's right. And then there's Defence Bank and Australian Military Bank. Australian Military Bank are the only channel open through to brokers. So the other 2 are direct to bank. So then that leaves the broker, whose role probably has 40 banks on their panel, they've only got one option for DOHAS. And at the moment, don't quote me on this, but I believe the SLA or the service agreement is about 14 days for Australian Military Bank to pick up a file. So it's very clunky to go through the broker channel. Yeah. So I guess it's common for some brokers to say it's not worth it, let's just get a cheaper rate elsewhere. But if we look at the subsidy on the tier 1, 2 and 3, you know, 590 roughly on tier 1, 866 on tier 2, and about 1,150 on tier 3. That's a fairly decent interest rate that it needs to be lower than what it is. So even if the 3 providers of DOHAS are slightly higher in interest, the difference that they would need to save you would be...
It's huge. Yeah, I did some back of kind of envelope calculations for this. And I think it was from the average home loan. From the average home loan, it's about 1.5% on the average home loan. It's about $900 a month. So you'd have to have like a very big difference if you're talking like...
So even 1.5% on the top tier is not enough.
Yeah, and that's it, right? So it's a case of... Now, obviously, like if you were to go on like on a mortgage calculator online and you'll see interest rates for owner-occupiers maybe in the high 5s. You might see some investment property mortgages that might be low 7s, but it's not actually that big of a spread. You know, you're going to be within, realistically, if you've got, you're going to have a certain amount of money that you can put down. So you're going to fall in some LVR bracket, whether it's like 90+% down to 80, down to 70. Really, you know, you're going to be within a fraction of a percent either way. So 1.5% is really, really big.
It's massive. I'd love to see a broker that could actually live up to that claim.
Yeah.
You know, because lenders tier their interest rates to their risk, right? So if we're comparing a 70% LVR loan to a 95% LVR, as in we've got 30% deposit and 5% deposit, obviously the interest rates could vary by 1.5%.
Yes.
But we're not. When we're comparing a person's got, say, 5% or 10% deposit, they're going to their full 40 banks with the exact same risk appetite or risk profile So they're going to have very similar interest rates. They're not going to have that broad variance of 1.5. It just won't happen.
It's going to be small fractions of a 0.0 difference, not 1.5%. And so that was I was doing those kind of back of envelope calculations. Like that doesn't sit particularly well with me. But I know that's something at Discover Buyers Agency that you specialize in, which is you understand that it is actually kind of complex if you're in defense or if you're just transitioning out of defense, or even if you're, defense adjacent, you can kind of help people on that journey to understand if you're in defense, DOHAS and these other benefits at your fingertips, but also just help people understand the property journey more broadly. And that's what you do.
And the sequencing is so important when we're talking about these HPAS, DOHAS, and then we're bringing in the home guarantee scheme with certain lenders that are, non-defence grants that they're entitled to. So the sequencing is critical to maximise the opportunity that's available to you. But if done right, as we sort of discussed in that, I can't remember the figure from the top of my head, but it was about almost $18,000 a year. That the total benefit was if you get the sequencing right.
I mean, that's like no small amount to turn your nose up at. And even with this, the sequencing. I've always been a big advocate of using BAs and partnering with the experts because, for a lot of Aussies out there, you help people scale, right? So you help people intimately, and this is actually our theme for today's podcast, which is building an investment portfolio like the top 1%. But you help people scale to those multi property portfolios. But for a lot of Aussies out there, you might sell a couple of houses in your entire lifetime. You would not be as good at negotiating as someone that does it every day, every week as their job. Like, you need to tap into that expertise.
That's right. Like, you can defend yourself in court, but
do you want to?
That's right. And the thing with property is it's such a big transaction with the entry cost and the exit costs are so significant that if you do get it wrong, it can be quite expensive to unwind some mistakes. So for a relatively small fee and that, using a buyer's agent can really sort of strip out and remove as many errors as possible in building and scaling that portfolio, I guess.
100%. And I know this is something that we're going to get onto later, but just as a little bit of a teaser, it is you're buying that expertise. You're also buying the research. I've got a day job and I write and I podcast about property. But even when I sit down with people like yourself, and I know you and I were out for lunch a few weeks ago, a month ago maybe, just actually it would have been before that, even just before Christmas. But the level of your expertise in this field and in certain suburbs, in certain cities was so far beyond what I could do. Even though I write and talk about property every single day and I'm sitting there listening, I'm like, I had no idea of any of this. And like the strategy that you pursued to build that, to build your own portfolio and to advise your clients, even though my job is property, I was just like, I was left behind. So that's why you do need to partner with people that are in the know.
Yeah. And I guess it's like we've all got the same amount of hours in a day, and we all have work and stuff. Do you want to be doing that research, or and trying to get it right yourself, or do you want to outsource it to someone that lives it and breathes it?
Yeah.
But I guess it's being cautious of who you outsource it to, like we just discovered. So if a broker is potentially saying just forget about DOHAS, it's probably raises a question there that is that the right person for you? Same as if there's a buyer's agent that might be saying, don't use DOHAS, because, DOHAS, you generally would have to live in it for the first 12 months. So if that buyer's agent is trying to sell you a house and land package, or they're a property group selling you a house and land package, they could be saying, don't use DOHAS and HPAS, to influence that they want you to buy this house and land package versus, getting your sequencing right. And as we sort of touched on in the last episode, is the now versus later of using these grants. When you're at the start, building a portfolio is very slow, from saving our initial deposit to when we've made that purchase, letting it build equity till we can make the next one. So using the grants at the start is going to help accelerate that process, versus if we've got 3, 4, 5 properties in our portfolio, that DOHAS and HPAS subsidies are very minimal amount compared to our overall position. So again, if someone's saying, nah, don't worry about using them, just consider if that's right. There's always different situations for different people, and everyone is uniquely different to each other. But, making sure it's transparent advice to your situation and that someone's there to help you and not sell you something.
Yeah, and even just, that $900 to your serviceability is a key way to unlock that future scalability, which is actually what we're talking about today. Kane, we're discussing building and scaling the portfolio, your property portfolio, like the top 1% of investors. And I think this is something that's everyone's ears are going to perk up when they hear this. And you've got 5 key steps for investors to be like the top 1%. Step 1, Kane, take us away.
Yeah, so I guess this is so last episode was that getting off the starting block and getting that. So this is for current serving veterans or defence businesses, anyone ex-defence, and even, potentially if you're not defence and that, this would still apply. But step 1 is planning, setting our goal and reverse engineering a strategy to achieve that goal. So everyone knows whether you might be self-employed with a business or an athlete, having a goal and then a program or a plan to achieve that goal is critical. If we don't know where we're going, how do we know when we get there? So starting out, step 1's create the goal and the strategy to achieve it. Things in the goal can be the time frame. So the goal could be X amount of net worth, 2 million net worth by age 40. Could be 5 properties, a number of properties, a passive income figure. It's all just about identifying what that goal is and then setting a time frame to it. We're going to consider things like purchasing property in our personal names. When do we incorporate maybe some property in our self-managed super fund? Or is purchasing in a trust structure appropriate for our plan and our goal? And depending on how big that goal is, it may or may not be applicable. And a big part that does get overlooked a little bit when goal setting is our risk profile. Yeah. So different people have different tolerances to risk profile or risk in their portfolio. Being defence, we've got a very stable income, which is great. But someone with a higher risk profile may be willing to run their buffer accounts or their post-purchase liquidity a little bit leaner than someone that likes that sleep at night factor, and they might want 6 months worth of mortgage repayment sitting in their offset account, or 6 months of mortgage of shortfall between repayments and rent and things like that. So there's a few different ways that we can work out our buffers, but it's about identifying our risk profile. And it can things like LVR or loan to value ratio. So if we've got $2 million worth of property with $1.9 million worth of debt, that's pretty high LVR. So you would probably in that scenario want more buffer money sitting in the bank versus, $2 million worth of property, but, 1.2 million of lending. You've got a fair bit of equity there, so you may be willing to fly that a little bit closer to the sun with our buffer money. And also the number of properties in the portfolio, being we've only got one property and say that property, we bought it in a hot market, it's grown, it's got equity, but then the market's a bit cooler, it can take longer to sell it. So if we ever need to reduce the debt or we've maybe discharged and starting a new career, things like that. But if we've got 3 or 4 properties and all in different markets, we can strategically pick which one we're gonna sell. So
absolutely,
there's a fair bit of risk profiling and goal setting that's pretty important to get right at the start.
And, I'm a big fan of giving, my own examples. And this is an example that you and I spoke about last time on the podcast, Kane, which is with that goal and strategy setting. When I first started my journey, I think my wife and I, we didn't have a set in stone goal, a set in stone strategy. Our only strategy was property equals hot, therefore buy property, doesn't matter. And that's a way of doing it, but it's not very. You don't really know what you're working towards, right?
We all start there, I think.
Well, I think we do all start there, and we sat down. That's where we tried to buy that, and this is that discussion that we had last time when we were looking at that really blue chip suburb in Brisbane, and we would have gotten some decent capital growth from it, but at what cost? Because if you buy in, say, for example, 2 blue chip of a suburb, you might not be able to scale with house 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 because you've anchored yourself onto the one, or you leave yourself open to market fluctuations, which if you bought the one house and you're rent vesting, you're putting all your money into that one investment property, and then suddenly your own rent goes up, and now you are in a financially precarious position. That's where you have goal and strategy to dictate what your next steps are. And yes, go on.
It can impact, like opportunity cost comes into it as well. Like if they purchased in Perth in 2008, we're potentially looking down the barrel of
10 years of not much.
10, 14 years of nothing. So, and Perth's a capital city in Australia.
Yeah.
So, is that blue chip? Like define blue chip. And that's where, I guess, leading into step 2 is the market research. But, you know, if you were to buy in Perth in 2008, you were just, you know, you didn't get any equity uplift in such a long period of time. It can really hold you back. So,
and in that kind of mortgage repayment scale, for our listeners, I'm drawing it with my finger, so I'm sorry if you can't say. But you know, when you're initially paying back a mortgage, and most of it is interest. So realistically, you know, if you have tenants in there for over 10 years, they haven't paid down even a majority of the debt.
There's an epic graph out there, and I think with a standard mortgage, P&I repayments over 30 years, in the first, the first 10 years, you pay off. No, first 20 years, you pay off 1/3, and the last 10 years, you pay off 2/3. You know what I mean? So it's so slow at the start. And I'd actually encourage anyone that does have that mortgage, you know, on their first property and is paying it off principal and interest, just jump online and Google extra repayment calculator, punch in an extra $50 a week or fortnight or $100, and just look at the impact that makes over the 30 years, and you'll shave years and years off your mortgage. They're quite common, those calculators, and most brokers should be able to provide that info to you as well.
Yeah, I think my wife and I managed to, with our owner-occupier, shave off about 8 years by going weekly with the repayments and then adding in a couple of grand a month into the offset. But that, going back, that's also a risk appetite question, which is exactly what you should be factoring into that goal setting, that strategy, which is my wife and I are actually quite risk averse, which is why we're doing this. And there are going to be a lot of people out there that say, you know, don't pay your owner occupier down sooner because you can take that money, you can buy other investment properties. That's not wrong. That's right. Your personal strategy. My wife and I are a little bit more not skeptical. My wife and I are a little bit more risk averse, so then we took a different strategy. But that is why you start that with step one.
Yeah, and that's where that rent vesting piece comes in. We did a whole episode on it, and it's a brilliant strategy. But if you're wanting to live and stay in one home, you know, that owner occupier, there's nothing wrong with that. It can be appropriate depending on your risk profile, also your career. Some people will spend a lot longer in one location where it might be more appropriate. But so step 2 is market research and selection. So we're going to consider sort of high level here. We've got someone that maybe has 3 properties and they're all in Queensland. So straight away that to me says, well, let's move away from Queensland. And where's another market that's going to meet the portfolio needs, but also minimise the potential for land tax, have a different market so one's growing. You know, you're diversified away from being concentrated in that one market. But if we look at Australia-wide, there's 15,000 suburbs approximately. And I guess the number one mistake, I believe, that most novice or new property investors make is I live in Helensvale or I live in the inner west in Sydney. I'm just going to buy an investment property here because I need to see it and touch it. But there's no real research into, you know, those 15,000 suburbs, where does that one that we live in stack up against the rest of them? So we need to have some sort of process to filter that down to where is the top 1%. Because if we're in the top 1% of suburbs, you know, we should perform well.
On that note, you and I were talking a few months ago about buying, I think, one of your guests bought in Mackay. And we did quick maths on the podcast, and the yield was twice what my suburb yield is in Sydney. Yeah. So in that sense, if you're not making your money work for you, if you feel, I need to buy something here so I can see it, so I can touch it, or you have that expectation that Sydney will be the blue chip, you're actually not making your money work for you as effectively as you think you are, because there are going to be smaller capitals or regional areas out there that are going to far, far, far outperform it.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why we want to filter to our unique portfolio for each individual person. So we don't say like Mackay or Brisbane or wherever is the go-to place where we need to be investing. We say where is the go-to place for you, your risk profile, your goals, and your situation, so we can then find what's right for you, because everyone's risk profile and goals are completely different.
100%. Now, I do have a question, because like you mentioned before, land tax.
Yeah.
Now, that's something that I think a lot of our listeners would be people around defence who actually kind of starting their journey, and they look at the process, they see how complicated it is, they turn to experts like yourself to try and understand how to get the sequencing right, how to do it. Land tax seems to frighten a few people. I know in Victoria, it's something that people talk about, like it's, oh gosh, land tax, like we're so frightened of it. For novices, and I don't mean that in a derogatory, just people that are new to this, what is land tax? How is it roughly calculated? And what kind of bills could people be looking at if they're investing?
Yes, every state's different, and they will have a threshold, so where land tax kicks in. I guess the important thing to distinguish is it's not applicable on your own occupier property, so it's only on your investment portfolio. And then it's about sitting down with your accountant or understanding where that threshold is, and making sure that, you know, potentially if we're approaching that threshold in Queensland, we then maybe consider a different state and knowing where those thresholds are, so we can start strategically building a national portfolio where we're just letting some of those thresholds influence where we might go, but still picking a good market in that different state. So rather than being concentrated in one state where we hit a threshold and then we've got land tax exposure. So
so that's different. It's different in every state.
Yeah, each state's different. People will use things like trusts or it's essentially a different entity, but then there's different thresholds for trust versus personal, and also, you know, and then potentially do we purchase in a self-managed super fund to, you know, move away from it into a different entity but keep investing in that. So it just comes into that whole strategy piece.
Absolutely. Now, step 2, we moved on. So market research. Now, I want to dispel a few myths with this. In particular, a lot of people in property, and I see it, you would see it every day, I'm sure, that their level of research is, you know, realestate.com.au, and that's a great place to start. You know, it is important to understand the market, to understand what market you're going into and using all the tools that are available there, and that's fantastic. How does Kane go about doing research into whittling down those 15,000 suburbs to find the one standout place?
So it's kind of like that process of elimination. So we start with, we want high confidence data. So then that's going to remove like mining towns or sovereign islands, like
the
those
kind of ups and downs.
Yeah. So then we've got consistent, reliable data to use, and it doesn't have high variances. We then might look at affordability. So an area needs to be affordable for the masses to come along and buy to help drive prices. If somewhere is highly unaffordable, it's unlikely that the prices will keep going and becoming further and further.
And that's been really reflected in 2024's data, where and this is a great example, and I know I've hammered this home a little bit this podcast, but you don't have to buy in the quote unquote the blue chip suburb. You don't have to buy the suburb that's 2 kilometres from the CBD, 3 kilometres from the CBD, because we saw last year most capital growth was in those affordable entry-level suburbs.
The lower quartiles were outperforming.
Absolutely. And you can think of it like, you know, I dabble in property. I still wouldn't be able to afford basically any of Sydney's eastern suburbs, right? So like the barriers to entry are so massive that really you're not going to have that flood of capital going into the upper quartile suburbs.
Because they're already unaffordable.
You know,
so, so yeah, and then we look at, so we know we're high confidence, affordable. We want a low stock environment. So it doesn't matter what we're talking about. Supply and demand of any item determines the price movement. So if we're in a low stock environment, so for a suburb, we would like to see less than 2% stock on the market at any one point in time. We'd like to see the inventory nice and low. So it's kind of looking at the stock on the market, but how long expressed in months does it take for the current demand levels to absorb all that supply that's on the market. And then building approvals is incoming or new supply. So stock on market and inventory measure existing supply, and building approvals is additional and new supply. So we want to see that nice and low as well. And then we want to see days of market and vacancy rate nice and low. So that's they're a couple of demand indicators. Then we know we're in a pretty good region or suburb. And then we just want to jump into each into one and analyse the trend lines, the 1, 3, 5 year growth rates, and just put a bit of a human touch to each individual suburb once we've got it down from the initial filtering. And that in itself is going to get us to less than 100 suburbs Australia-wide from that 15,000. And we can influence the number by saying stock on market 1.25, not 2%, and inventory under 3 or under 1. The tighter we make that criteria, the more it's going to filter. But if we filter too tight and it puts us somewhere too regional, we're not going to like that. So it's that balance between filtering it down enough to around that 100 mark, and then we can jump into each one and have a look at it, where it is, shortlist from that 100, and then we'll get that down to maybe 20, and then away we go.
Yeah, and you've got some infrastructure measurements there as well, which I really appreciate, because you're also looking at the longevity. I would hazard a guess the reason that you would look at the infrastructure spending per capita is that the longevity of money coming into the town or coming into the region.
But you said the per capita is what's important there. So we want to see how much is it per person in that suburb. So each suburb may have different number of people living in it, different number of dwellings, and then a $1 billion project is going to be different depending on the number of people in that area. So by expressing it as a per capita basis, we can then compare. We've got 4 or 5 suburbs on our list, and we can see the infrastructure spend as one figure and know it's just as impactful per capita, for that region. So it's quite a nice little way to just be able to quickly summarise the amount of infrastructure in that area or suburb.
Now, step 3 is something that I know a lot of people are very, very interested in, because for people new to property, it might be a little bit mysterious. It's buying on market versus off market.
Yep. So on market's all our major portals, realestate.com, Domain, and they're generally properties that are listed by a sales agent with a full campaign. So the vendor's paid for their marketing, they've paid for their photos, and it's a full-on campaign. So we want to be searching those portals daily. Then also through key relationships, we'll be looking to purchase and search off-market as well. So an off-market property could be pre-market, we'll call it an off-market, but its intent is there to go on market, but they might be waiting for a tenant to move out. They could be getting ready for cleaning the property up, doing a couple of paint touch-ups and things to make sure it looks good for photos. But the intent is that it goes on market, but there could be that opportunity to purchase at pre-market. It could be off-market, like it's tenanted and it's still got 9 months to run on the current lease. So the agent may advise their vendor, let's try and sell it off-market. So there's different types of off-markets, but it's just another avenue for to find stock. It's key to take note that just because it's off-market doesn't mean it's better or worse. So a lot of off-markets will still get rejected on due diligence, and we won't proceed with them anyway. So they're not better or any different. It's just another avenue for us to access more stock.
And what do you mean by not necessarily making it through due diligence?
Well, step 4 is, so we've filtered down, we've got our goal, our strategy, we've selected our markets, we're searching, and then we find something. So once we find a property that we like in our area, we want to carry out a full suite of due diligence. It's kind of like our safety check on the property. And this is going to put it, so we're in the top 1% of suburbs in Australia. We want to be buying the top 1% of properties in that suburb. So we look at flood mapping, bushfire mapping, housing commission checks. They're our non-negotiables. And then we go into our deep dive, main roads, roundabouts, power line, cemetery, substation, block shape, size, floor plan. We want to make sure that we're buying a good property that appeals to the masses. Because what can happen if we look at a family with 3 kids and they're not going to fit in a 3-bedder, so they want that 4-bedder, but we know we're in a hot market. prices are moving and they're getting frustrated because they keep missing out. And then they go buy that ugly duckling on the main road with a big power line hanging over it. Okay. And they probably spend $50,000 too much because they listened to the sales agent that told them what they needed to pay. But they're in the market, they're happy. If that's an investment property and when we purchased it, days on market might have been sitting at 20. So they're selling nice and quick. And that was what caused that frustration for that buyer. If we fast forward 15, 20, 30 years time, and that's an investment property and it's time to sell it, if we're having a medical emergency in the family, we're transitioning to retirement, for whatever reason we've decided to sell that property, and days on market's now trended to 90, and the market's not so hot because it's 20, 30 years later, the good ones are taking 90 days to sell.
Imagine what it says about yours. Yeah.
We've got that ugly duckling on the main road with the power line hanging over
You're
it.
cutting that price a lot.
Yeah. You're sitting on the market for 300 days and you're cutting the price, and that's the last thing you want to do. If you're transitioning in retirement, medical emergency, whatever reason you've decided to sell, you don't want to be heavily discounting the price. So due diligence gets paid off quite often. A lot of people don't do any due diligence, but it's one of the things that will safeguard us and our portfolio years down the track. So it's very critical.
Yeah, and there was again recent statistics that came out regarding areas and things that people would not and would live around. I think it was 16% of people said, and I know you mentioned this before, 16% of people said they'll never live near a cemetery. And it was and I thought it was funny because it was 16% of people said they wouldn't live near a cemetery, but then 12% said they wouldn't live near a main road. And I looked at that and I was like, I probably would have thought it'd be the other way around. Not that I would necessarily want to look out my window at a graveyard, right? But I was like, at least be kind of quiet. You're not going to have, noise and neighbors doing bad stuff versus the constant sirens or traffic with the main road. I thought it was interesting statistics, but it does go to show that for a lot of buyers, whether it's people buying for an owner-occupier or even renters or people buying for an investment, people do have a very long list of non-negotiables. And in terms of that ugly duckling, it might work at the time, but if you suddenly transition to a market where people can have their pick, your non-negotiables are immediately going to wipe out 20% of prospective buyers, which is 1 out of 5 people who would be viewing your open home now suddenly don't even rock up.
But it even impacts even if we look past, when we sell it, people may say to due diligence, well, I'm never going to sell it, so what does it matter? What if vacancies when you buy are at 1%, but then 5 years, 10 years later, vacancies might increase to 3%, and that ugly duckling is then going to impact your tenant because all of a sudden tenants may be spoiled for choice.
100%.
So then your vacancy on your property. So just because you're never going to sell it, if that's your philosophy, that's okay. It doesn't mean that we discard due diligence.
Oh, don't hedge. You got to hedge against it just in case because, and maybe it's a psychological thing, maybe it's a mindset thing, but growth might not be forever, or growth might shift. Look at the Melbourne market and how many people have exited the Melbourne market to jump on new growth cities. Trends change over time, and don't.
Are trends changing now?
Trends are changing now, and it's good to at least be safe about it. Yeah. Because if it's going to be a case of you might pay an extra $10,000, $15,000 to minimize those non-negotiables, well, you're hedging, right? Yeah. And I think that's fantastic. So you mentioned also it's not just those cosmetic things. It's not just the annoyance factor maybe of a main road or power lines. It's also weather. And I know you're from Queensland. One big thing up your way is flooding, especially in Brisbane. It seems like half the city goes underwater, or as we saw with our recent fires in Sydney, there were areas which really should not have necessarily been fire impacted that were. How do you go about doing your due diligence with high-risk weather?
Yeah, so flood mapping on the council's website, flood overlays, fire mapping.
Is that literally like a map?
Literally a map, and pick out the property and zoom right in, and you can put your different overlays to check it out. So, and then just knowing your areas as well, and that it's and it's quite tricky in some areas towns or say even North Queensland where you are prone to that tropical weather,
the monsoon season.
Yeah, which Townsville has just gone through, I guess. So it is, important to get that mapping and that, and just know what you're buying and where it is, and what sort of potential likely impacts it will face.
Yeah. Now I'm not a BA or a real estate agent. Up Brisbane way, but my logical next thought would be like, with this, and this is why you need that local knowledge, because if you're overlaying flood maps and stuff, there would be, I would hazard a guess, streets where to buy the bottom house might be a fair bit cheaper than buying as in like at the bottom of the hill house is a fair bit cheaper than buying the top of the hill house. Yeah. And if you're maybe from Sydney or from another market and you're looking to just dump your money into another house as a store of value, and you're, oh, this is great, this is a great deal, but it's at the bottom of the hill, you could potentially be relatively overpaying. If you're like, oh, this street seems amazing, would I be offering?
And you're going to feel that annual pain in your insurance premiums as well.
Of course.
You know, so it's not just I'm happy to take that risk and we'll see what happens over the next 20 years. Like, you're going to be paying higher premiums for flood impacted areas, and you'll have less insurers, and less insurance means less competition, higher premium. So, that local knowledge, or at least a process to identify, what it is you're buying and where, is important.
Absolutely. Now that takes us to step 5, which is comparable sales analysis. Comparable sales analysis, negotiation, and purchase. And you and I were talking about this before. Like, this is fundamental even to the negotiation side, which is what I say to everyone, especially when people seem to sometimes gawk at BA fees, and it's like, man. Even if it's for an owner-occupier, it's like, how many times have you negotiated an asset worth in the high hundreds of thousands of dollars, potentially millions of dollars? Oh. I'm going to guess a big fat 0, as in this to the person that I'd be talking to. Go to the guy that does it 200 times a year. Yeah. Like, agents have got every trick in the book. Oh, if you come up that extra 10, they'll do it right. If you come up that extra 20, they'll do it right. Oh, the other guy, he's already done his building a pest. You're really going to have to make it worthwhile. You're going to get sucked into all the sales tactics. Speak to the professional. Make it easy for yourself.
It's funny. I was literally, we purchased a property for a client. I was an owner-occupier on the Gold Coast, first home buyer, and we inspected the property with the agent in the kitchen. Client or buyer signed the contract. Price was agreed on. We walked out of the house, out of the car. It was like, congratulations, we're all happy. And then literally before we got in the car, the agent called and said, you need to pay another $10,000.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm standing there with our client and the buyer, and I said, it's not going to happen. Like, we know that it's not worth that for starters. We're happy at this price point. And he said, we'll meet us halfway and come to up another $5. And I said, I'll call you back. And we had a chat with the buyer, and they gave me authority to pay the extra $5, which then puts you in a position like it's very serious to spend other people's money.
Yes.
So I went away and I called the agent back and basically said, like, although we are a first home buyer, we love this property and it's ticks all their boxes. We've got the second option, which is open home tomorrow, that we're going to go look at. And the third option is off market. And I know that off market, we're definitely going to get it. So by the end of this weekend, this client will be under contract, but this is their first property. And he quickly resorted to, yep, let's do it at the agreed price.
Yep.
But I guess the point of the story is that if I wasn't involved, because I've seen that before, I wasn't emotionally involved, the client and the buyer was, they said, yes, go up $5 if you need to get it. We don't want to miss it. In most cases, the average buyer would probably have gone to up 10 initially.
I did that. I did that.
Because you just say, Mr. Agent's telling me I need to pay that, so I'm going to pay it because I don't want to miss out because I'm emotionally invested. Yeah. It was a good experience. Yeah. We almost saved the entire fee back in the one conversation there.
Well, literally, right? I did that. They said we'll do it now if you throw in the extra 10. I'm like, yeah, let's do it. And it was only looking back that, oh man,
got me.
It's small things, but that's why you partner with the experts, because as you identify, they call you up and you're like, oh yeah, I've seen this before. Like, don't treat me like a mug. Yeah. But because you do the hundreds of these things, this is your day to day versus someone that's literally never done it before. So step 5 is comparable sales analysis, negotiation, and purchase. Talk us through that sequence.
Yeah. So I guess, like, before I got to that point in that example, we got to know what its fair value is. So then we look at comparable sales, and basically what we're doing there is looking in the last 3 months, all the recent properties within 1 kilometre, 2 kilometres of the subject property. So how much did they sell for? and give them a rating: superior, inferior, similar, slightly superior, slightly inferior. Then we can build out a bit of a bracketing system there and say, okay, this one's superior, it's sold for this. This one's inferior, it's sold here. Then I know people can't see my hands here, but hopefully the message is still coming across. And then we build out a price range on superior and inferior properties and similar. And then we can say, okay, this property's worth 670 to 700 with a high level of confidence. That's our guide for negotiations. And then I guess when it's an investor, it's just black and white. Can we secure it in that price range? And if we can, great. If we miss out because vendor expectations are high or there's other bidders because we know we're in a hot region, we let it go and just move on to the next one. Then if it's an own occupier, you have a very small little bit of tolerance there because all of a sudden motions are high and, you can't rely purely on a comparable and that. So we may have a bit more give when it comes to price range for an own occupier. But investor is very black and white, stick to our fair value market range. And then if we can secure it, happy days. So is that comparables with similar, inferior and superior properties that sort of guides us. And that's how we know we can either walk away or, we've got a good deal here.
Which is, it's gutsy of you in that example you gave before where you were like, you're willing to put up a bit of a fight over 10K. Now, and it says a lot about you as a person that you're like, you can't just spend a client's money. And, I'm sure that there are BAs out there that would happily do it, right? To just get rid of the headache, we just sign on the dotted line, then I can move on to my next client. So actually, firstly, it says a lot about your character that you would put in the fight for it. But that's what at least gives you the confidence because you've done the analysis of what this house is worth. You've done the price analysis, you've done the quality analysis, you've done all of your due diligence to say, actually, in the scheme of things, when you're talking about several $100,000, 10K doesn't sound like much, but you had so many data points at your fingertips that you were actually willing to say, I don't know, no, this isn't worth that extra 10K.
Yeah. And the emotions were high, and so it puts a lot of pressure. I felt the pressure too. Yeah. Because they wanted it and they've said, pay the extra $5 to get it. But sometimes you just have to back yourself and know that can we still get this at a lower price? Because that's the job.
Yeah.
Save money in the transaction where we can.
Now, one other part of this ultimately comes down to the campaign and good and bad agents. How does the campaign factor into this?
Yeah, I guess I like to say that good agents are hard to buy from and bad agents present good buying opportunities.
Yeah.
So a good agent might, list a property, days on market's quite low, they're selling nice and quick. So they might list it on Tuesday and receive an offer during the week. They'll still have their open home on Saturday. They may even do another open home on Monday and they'll receive multiple offers through the weekend and they'll present them all on Tuesday. So they've given everyone a fair chance to put an offer in, view the property on 2 occasions, best offer wins. So they're creating competition and that's going to create a harder environment for us to buy in. Whereas another agent may list that same property on Tuesday, receive an offer during the week. They'll still do the open home maybe on Saturday, but then they'll say, okay, closing offers at 4 p.m. this afternoon. By putting that time constraint, and everyone's different here, so it's not necessarily a good and bad agent, but it could be that the vendor's under time pressure to get it under contract. But then by having that cutoff at 4 p.m. on Saturday, they're limiting some of the competition. Maybe someone couldn't make it. Absolutely. And they were planning on going on Monday. Yeah. So by limiting, but that puts time pressure on the buyer. So we have to react to each campaign differently. But, because they're limited some of that competition, they may have limited someone that was willing to pay more than us, and so we may get it at a better price. So just understanding that, and then same with off markets. Is it exclusive? Is it a relationship that we have with that agent that we've done many transactions with that is exclusive to us? So they've said, Kane, do you have a client for this? We'll run it through our due diligence, and if it ticks all the boxes, we may proceed, or we say no, and then they may offer it to a network of buyers agents. Or it could just be they've offered to us, including a handful of buyers agents. And if no one buys it, then they're going on market. So different opportunities through different sources, but it's assessing each campaign and its value before making that purchase so we know exactly what we're buying.
And in terms of that exclusive relationship with agents, this is where, you coach your clients, as in the buyer, through this process, and you see it time and time again where it's small stuff that you can trump someone at the last second, which is if you're going into the contract phase and you've proactively done building and pests, you've proactively read, like, if it's a unit, read the strata report, or you've already got your pre-approval, you've got all these things, you're ready for financing, you've got it, versus the people that are still pending pre-approval or haven't done their building and pests yet, or hang on, let me send my strata report to the conveyancer, let me send this through, and they're a few steps behind. That's where, with your relationships with the agent, you talk to them, you're like, my guy's ready to go. We could pull the trigger in the next hour if you give us the nod. The people that we're going against, they're at least 2 weeks off. Yeah. In a realistic sphere. And that's where, you can actually start saving an extra 5, 10K, and you're in a better negotiating position.
And it's also understanding, I guess, the overall big picture. So in a lot of these markets, vendors don't want to become buyers. So if they're upsizing or downsizing, they're selling to go somewhere else and buy. A lot of things that's holding people back from selling at the moment is they don't want to go buy in the same market and in that same competition. If we can understand their position, we can potentially offer our clients an investor. So we may offer a lease back for 3, 6, 12 months. What do you need? So it's about problem solving.
Yeah.
And we've won deals 10, 20, 50,000 under, depending on the price point of other bids and offers, because we're willing to offer a lease back.
So talk to us about that. So that's a very interesting point, right? So that is, hey, I'm the buyer, you're the seller. Hey, I acknowledge, Kate, it might take you a couple of months to buy another house. I'll let you live here and you pay me rent throughout that period.
If
so
my
you keep
house
it really
is 1.2 million and I've got no mortgage, I'm downsizing, kids are all moved out, an extra 25,000 may not change the world for me. If I've got to go move once into a rental or a hotel with all my belongings in storage and then buy, whether that takes me 1, 3, 6 months, and then move again. My problem might not be an extra 25,000 is going to change the world.
Headache.
It's the headache. So it's understanding what's the actual problem and how do we solve that for this person to make us stand out in a crowded marketplace. So just understand in special conditions, there's so much it's not always price.
So firstly,
look for an edge and exploit that edge if we can.
So firstly, is that common? And secondly, how do you go about, so that's a key part of your negotiation, right?
Yeah.
So your client is an investor. You say to your client, hey, we actually might have an in here. We can lease back so the person doesn't need to move. They can take an extra month, 2 months, 6 months to find their next forever house. That we can take the headache off their shoulders. So firstly, how common is it? Secondly, how do you get that really important piece of intel?
It's just through conversations with the agent, asking the right questions. Do you have a relationship there? Some people, most commonly, price is the biggest motivator, and whoever has the biggest budget for that property wins. But it's common enough that you've got to be asking the questions to identify the opportunity. So I couldn't put a number on it, but
it's often enough that it pays to
that
ask.
it's there and it's real.
Yeah. Now, I think I might have misled everyone at the beginning of this podcast because I said there were 5 steps, but there are actually 6. Rinse and repeat. That's our favourite step.
Yeah, that's it. That's when and everyone's different again, and it's where you are in your journey. But I guess after a purchase, we want to do 3 and 6 month reviews. How's it all going? You've got a new mortgage, you've got a new tenant, and just how's that management process happening? And moving along. And then out at 12 months, that's our annual review that we're going to be doing. And we were reviewing what's the performance of the portfolio like? How are we tracking to our plan? If we said we want to buy 1 property a year for 5 years, we want to sort of somewhat stick to that plan. It's the same as, losing weight or getting fitter and healthier. We have our plan, but we're only as good as we execute that plan. So, rinse and repeat, review our plan, and back to the top to step one, and away we go again.
So what does, and I'm sure actually, given our listeners, I'm sure there are some people that almost might have accidentally, and this is something that we'll cover on other episodes, but they might have accidentally bought an investment property because they did all the right stuff. They got their DOHAS entitlements, etc. In their last posting, they've now moved. They've moved from, I don't know, Townsville to Adelaide. So they're now an investor, right? They've got an investment property without ever really meaning to. What does a 12-month review look like?
Well, where's the mortgage at?
Yep.
Balance. What's the interest rate of the mortgage? Is it appropriate to speak to how many years have you got of DOHAS left? As DOHAS, if you've discharged and you've got no more DOHAS subsidy coming in, is that still an appropriate loan? Do we need to refinance? Then looking at the property online, we can jump on and do valuation, sort of just get a ballpark figure of that property through that comparable sales analysis we spoke about. We can also look at some of the data providers that we've got to see what the performance of the suburbs been as well. So we can get a fairly good understanding on a price and equity uplift that we've had. And then, coming back to that plan is when will we planning on making our next purchase?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Now, what typically, what price ranges do you specialize in overall, or is it kind of dictated by the buyer?
Yeah, it's very much dependent on the buyer and where they are in their journey. So typically, if we've got a single person, like they're going to be restricted by budget, I guess, if they've got one income. Obviously the dinks or the double income, no kids. Yeah. They've generally got the bigger budgets because they've got a lower level of expenses, so they can afford a bigger mortgage. But typically, 500 to 1.2.
That's quite broad.
It's quite broad. Yeah. But many variables will impact it. And same if it's the first or the fifth property in the portfolio. There's obviously the serviceability side of the equation, but also the deposit or equity position of the portfolio as well. So many factors will impact their overall budget. Yeah.
So what would it look like for? So say there's a young couple listening to this and they're hungry. They want to do it, and they've heard the whole debt and equity game, and I don't know, you kind of buy one and then you wait a little bit, you buy multiple, you scale up, you might sell one, you might consolidate, you might go for the passive income. I suppose, given that it is quite confusing, what does that game look like? And not from like necessarily a step-by-step point of view, but from like a year-on-year point of view. If for our young, hungry listeners, what would that look like?
Very active, I guess, because markets can, like that example of Perth. So we might, if you were brought in Perth in, say, 2002, for 6 years, you probably had very good growth, But then from 2008 to 2020 or 2021 even, you've had 14 years of nothing.
Yeah.
So if we want to play that active role, we have to be able to roll profits or roll equity uplift into new deals. So it may mean that in 2008 we would sell that Perth property to then go buy elsewhere, so we can keep chasing those growth markets, versus that passive person that mainly want to buy, because Defence have a fairly good super scheme as well. So they may, and this comes back to that strategy and goal, that their goal is not that big, hairy, audacious, that they may only want 3 investment properties to go with their super and, other assets they may have. So it could be 3 over a 15, 20-year time frame, and very healthy equity position, reducing debt, consistently paying them down. So it can be as active or as passive as you like, but it all comes back to that step one, which is that what are we trying to achieve? And I guess the bigger the goal, the more aggressive we have to be with our strategy.
And the active versus passive. Well, I don't mean passive as in passive income, but the active hands-on approach versus the passive. The passive approach is very critical, because if you have an asset that is underperforming, you might look to sub it off. There's no point necessarily getting emotional over it and hoarding it. And I know there's no shortage of investors out there that swear black and blue, I will never sell. But at what point are you almost robbing yourself that if you sold to put your money into a boom market, really all you're doing is, I mean, the loss of it would be a few transaction fees. That would be probably stamp duty and a few conveyancer fees. But apart from that, you're taking a lump of cash from a market that's not moving into a market that's going up. And
it's opportunity cost that's real there that is often overlooked. Like, if that money wasn't tied up in an underperforming asset, where would it be and what would it be doing, you know? And then, like you say, there's no shortage of investors that are never, ever sell. And I'm not arguing that that's right or wrong, but depending, again, coming back to that goal and the strategy is what you're trying to achieve. Yeah. You know, it may be appropriate for an underperforming asset to, you know, cop the cost or the loss, you know, move into a better market and keep moving forward. So it's that sideward step to keep going forward, I guess.
And yeah, you might be on that point with an asset that capital gains wise is underperforming, but you've paid off so much for that you're actually getting a really good passive income. The yield is still fantastic. There might be reasons. So it's unique to every person. It's unique to their profile. It's unique to their financial circumstances, where they are in life, which is, you know, maybe a bit of a plug, Kane, which is why you speak to the experts to understand how to craft it, to understand what the opportunities are.
That's it. So reach out, Kane at discoverbuyersagency.com.au. Just go to the website and jump on, fill out a form. Love to help.
Yeah. And if you do have any questions, reach out. Reach out to Kane or myself, Liam.Garman at momentummedia.com.au. If you have any questions for the podcast, do reach out, send them through. We'll answer them on the next episode, because I know that there was a fair bit of misinformation in the market. There's some misinformation
The
in the
more
market.
complex it is, the more opportunity it is to get it wrong. So, and you know, property lending, it's all very complex. And once we add in that layer of the defence lifestyle from DOHAS, HPAS, as well as living our lives 2 to 3 years at a time, it just adds so much more complexity. And
that's the thing, like, it is complex, right? It is complex, but for a couple of hours of your time, for what is relatively it's not a massive investment to partner with a BA, and to work with people like yourself that know it, you could be saving $900 a month. And also, that's one part of it. You understand the sequencing of it, but then you could also buy an off-the-market property and immediately save, like the example you gave before, immediately save 10K. Yeah. And then you can immediately do this, and then you immediately do that. And then suddenly, like, it actually financially makes a lot of sense.
It stacks up pretty quickly.
Stacks up super quick. Yeah. Super quick. Anyway, that is all we have time for today. It's Liam Garman and Kane Dury from Discover Buyer Agency. That was the ADF Property Podcast. And until next episode, bye-bye.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property, or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.